Medicine and the Machine podcast is brought to you by Medscape. Want the latest in medical news, expert perspectives, clinical tools, continuing medical education, and more? Stay on the pulse of medicine. Visit medscape.com.
Hello, it's Eric Topol, and I want to welcome you to the next Medicine and the Machine podcast. And with me today is Abraham Verghese and our special guest, our first guest for this podcast, Danielle Ofri. So welcome, Danielle.
Oh, it's great to be here, Eric.
Well, Danielle and Abraham go way back, so I'm going to first turn it over to Abraham to get things rolling.
Thank you so much, Eric. Danielle, it's great to have you on this podcast. I was thinking your whole career, unlike many of us, has really been spent at one institution, and that too a storied institution, Bellevue, which we associate with, every wave of immigration and the last bastion of care for so many of the needy in New York City. And I was wondering what and you've written so much about this, but what your view is, or what your observations are, having sort of watched technology move in from the era when most of us were using paper to where we are now. And I don't mean just electronic medical record. What's been your grand look back at how it's been?
Well, it depends how far you want to widen the lens. So Bellevue is the oldest public hospital in the United States, started back in 1736. And it's been importing technology, every generation, from the syringe, stethoscope, and all the new technologies. And I think with every wave, there's always a period of hesitation, concern, a little bit of umbrage. But then we make our peace and find what works and either take issue with or try to improve what doesn't work. And I think current technology is no different. We're always a little bit behind in the public hospital sector compared to our private counterparts, who are usually hop on the technology first. But sometimes that's an advantage, because when the negative parts come through, as they inevitably do, we let the folks in the private sector take the brunt first, and then we can be a little more thoughtful in how we approach it.
Wonderful. I always thought that, the wonderful humanism and humanity of an institution like Bellevue was so well captured by voices like yours, but I always marvel at our mutual friend and your former chair, his idea of putting together a literary publication, the Bellevue Literary Review, which went on to become a publisher, and one of its books won the Pulitzer Prize. Talk a little bit about that contrast of, technology, cutting edge medicine, and then a literary journal.
I certainly, no one was expecting to be involved in a literary journal when it started out. I was an MD PhD student. I did a PhD in biochemistry and was fully on track to be a laboratory scientist. And in fact, I was headed toward neurology, and since I was a neuroscience researcher, but I did my 1-year prelim internship in medicine at Bellevue and completely fell in love with the patients and the stories, and so stayed with internal medicine. But and that was during the height of the AIDS epidemic, which, as you all recall, was quite a difficult and dark time. So when I finished my 10-year stint of medical school and training, I really wanted a year off. And I took some time off, and during that time, I began to write down the stories of those patients. And I remember that it was a singular moment at the time, and that the patients we were meeting at that moment, I knew was something historical, and that I should be writing it down, but I didn't have the time. I think we were too close to the emotional bone. So only when I stepped back could I really start to think about the patients in more detail. And when I came back to Bellevue, I knew that I wanted to incorporate this somehow, but I didn't quite know how to do that. At that time, Marty Blazer came on as a new chair, and an astute colleague had us meet up because he was having the students write a 1,000-word essay on their medicine clerkship about anything inspired by patients. And I was asking my students in the clinic to just ask a patient what it's like to have their illness and write me an essay about that. And so we compared our stacks of essays and thought initially that we would make an in-house journal, kind of a mimeographed book of student writings. But as we talked more, it became apparent that there was such a wider societal I think, interest and fear about our health and vulnerability. And we decided to make a literary journal to use more creative ways to explore that. And so we began the Bellevue Literary Review. We started on the 16th floor of Bellevue, right off the medicine wards. And we took out a 2-line call for submissions. And we had 1,000 submissions in the wink of an eye.
Wow.
And it was clear that people have so much to think about medicine and health and illness that is not served by the top 10 tips for osteoporosis kind of medical writing that's already out there. and really by using fiction and poetry and creative nonfiction are ways to grapple with the issues that are not necessarily addressed by, typical, medical journalism. So that's really where it started, and we're coming on to 20 years now. And now we get about 4,000 submissions a year, so it has not let up.
Well, that's extraordinary. And, it's another reflection of the human side of medicine. Certainly not one to be mimicked by machines, at least any quality writing we can think of. But I was really interested, Danielle, in going back to a couple of your recent pieces. I read everything you publish, so I just love it. You have so much talent to articulate the things that the people in the medical community identify with. And in March, you wrote "Perchance to Think" in the New England Journal, which was quite exceptional. And you basically got the analogy, the metaphor was that medicine has become a petri dish for medical errors, patient harm, physician burnout, unnecessary tests, unnecessary referrals, and more. Can you elaborate?
That piece, it's interesting how one never knows what will resonate with readers. And for me, I was just writing about a really rotten morning. A patient walks in with a message from another doctor, rule out adrenal insufficiency and rheumatoid arthritis based on some random blood tests I sent. And I was trying to, take care of that while taking care of his other 10 chronic issues, and realizing that I simply could not process adrenal insufficiency at the same time as handling his diabetes and obesity. And what I really needed, I just needed some time to think. I just couldn't do it in the moment. And part of me felt like a dolt that I simply couldn't do it off the cuff and remember which way ACTH, diurnal variations were. I could not remember. And in the end, I sort of scribbled off, okay, refer to endocrine, let them figure it out. But I felt like I'd really punted, because I know that an internist should be able to work out the basics of adrenal insufficiency and rheumatoid arthritis. That's our job after all. But in 15 minutes, it is not possible to do it with any amount of thoughtfulness. And that so much of our referrals and testing is because we don't have a time to think. And if I had a half an hour or an hour to think, I probably could have gotten by without a lot of the tests and referrals I ended up doing. And I also know that in the book I'm working on now is on medical error. So I was attuned to the genesis of medical errors. Where do they start? And I could feel them starting at the moment because I knew I was giving short shrift. I was trying to read up to date while he's talking, and I'm trying to write what he's saying and read the things he's bringing in and scan up to date at the same time. And I knew that I would easily make mistakes. So it really does feel like a petri dish for error. And that if we're really want to tackle, medical error, we can't just keep making checklists, though they're certainly helpful in some situations. We also, especially when it comes to diagnostic error, need time to think and organize our thoughts.
Yeah,
Well, go ahead, Abraham.
Yeah, I was just you're going to say that you wrote about that so beautifully, and I think it echoes those famous series of photographs of William Osler at the bedside. He's inspecting, palpating, percussing, but then at the end there's this pose of him with one leg up on a chair, just looking at the patient with his chin in his hands, really contemplating. But I wanted to ask you, do you think that patient in that scenario might well have been the place where one day AI is going to save us by taking all those many facts that were whirling around the patient and sorting it out for you rather than forcing you to do it? I mean, I'm asking this hypothetically, but
well, I could envision AI helping with some of that. Like there was a lot of preparatory grudge work that, you're right, wasn't well spent, wasn't my time well spent. If someone could have said, here are all the tests laid out, here are the possible tests you need. Here are 4 reasonable options you can do. Here's the ones that are validated. And then maybe I could use my 15 minutes more efficiently instead of madly, going hither and thither, trying to pull the information out. So I could certainly see that. What I think AI could not do is help me figure out with a patient, well, what's important to you? We have 6 medical issues here. What is the most important for you? And what's your goal, in our medical care? Because you're right, if I put all of his attention on this, possible adrenal insufficiency at the expense of his diabetes that was really, wearing him down, maybe we weren't actually doing his overall health a benefit.
Right. Well, that's, I think, so remarkable in that you have this situation where you were kind of self-deprecating. You say, I'd managed to come out of this single case feeling ignorant, inept, and disgusted all at once. And in fact, I think that's very, very common because we have so little time. And I was interested, David Feinberg, who you may know, he was the CEO of the Geisinger health system before recently becoming that of Google Health leader. And he told me about a program at Geisinger that he had initiated where the doctors and patients were locked up in the exam room for 40 minutes. They weren't allowed to leave for 40 minutes. And he said it was the most popular program they'd ever initiated because the patients loved it. They had time to communicate. And the doctors thought it was extraordinary because it was like 3 times as much time as they previously would have ever had with a patient. The gift of time, the question that Abraham asked you, Danielle, if we could restore time with patients, that's why not only the title of the piece, but its content really struck home as, could we get there? How much do you think time is a determinant of the problems that we have today, both on the side of doctors and patients?
I think it's an enormous part of it. The problem is the time keeps getting filled, as we get, certain tools to make life easier, the EMR, other things come into their place. And so it's the sort of unopposed time that I think we need to actually discuss, because what is it that we do well as doctors? What do we do better than computers? Because, Lord knows the computer knows the 25 types of vasculitis better than I'll ever know them. And there's no point in trying to memorize them. But figuring out what the patient's most afraid of or wants to focus on, or what's happening in their life that's really impacting their ability to take their medications, that's what we do better. So we need to have the time, but not filled in by other tasks that, are easily piled on.
Right. And the other thing I wanted to get to was your more recent, just a couple months later, in the New York Times, you had an op-ed about the healthcare system. I guess the title you didn't pick, it was about exploiting doctors and nurses, but you were basically getting into the fact that healthcare has become corporatized. And there was an exceptional paragraph, a metaphor again, like the Petri dish, but this time was about a factory. I'm just going to read it. In a factory that you wrote, if 30% more items were suddenly dropped onto an assembly line, the process would grind to a halt. Imagine a plumber or a lawyer doing 30% more work without billing for it. But in healthcare, there is a wondrous elasticity. You can keep adding work and magically it all somehow gets done. The nurse won't take a lunch break if the ward is short of staff members. The doctor will squeeze in the extra patients. Can you amplify on that?
And part of what drove me to write that piece was the idea that one of the things that I love about working in medicine is my colleagues, the nurses and doctors, are incredible people, who by and large want to be there for the right reasons. They all no one goes into medicine now for fame or fortune, and that people go to Wall Street for that if they really want to make money in a lot faster time. But people go into medicine generally want to be there, want to help patients. And so they do the right thing by and large. We do, and no one clocks out without getting their work done. And I think at some point the system has realized that. And I'll put realize in quotes because I don't think it's a plot take advantage of doctors and nurses, but a recognition is that if you add extra work in or squeeze in more patients or require more work, it will get done because doctors and nurses do not shirk their duty, because if you don't do it, your patient will suffer. And if we think about what other profession would that happen, and we don't think much about it. And in the end, at some point, it becomes an exploitation of the professional ethic of clinicians.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think, and this is a question really for both of you, do you think that in some measure the failure is on our end because we have not sort of come together, nationwide or as a profession to say, these are the imperatives that we must have in order to take care of people well? I think it is the fact that unlike the assembly line workers, we don't protest, we don't organize in that fashion.
I would say partly, but I think reasons we don't is, one is we feel like it's a profession and not a job. And so we feel like that's part of our duty, and we take call after hours and we interrupt our kids' ballet recitals to take call. That's part of the job. We're also reasonably well paid. And so we accept that, and we get respect in society. And so it feels a bit unseemly to sort of fetch about, oh, I'm taking all these calls after hours. So we mostly don't feel comfortable doing that. But you're right. But at some point, I think we've reached a tipping point where now not only is it destroying doctors' lives, but it's really impacting patients and patient safety.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And there's a long history that you alluded to, Danielle, for doctors not really thinking about anything like that, busy with their work and kind of head down. And a lot of things happened along the way to promote the corporatization, no less, not just relative value units, but in more recent times, since the 90s, electronic medical record. There wasn't a whole lot of fight against that, and particularly since they were designed, as you both know, to promote billing and nothing to do with promoting the lives of patients or doctors or clinicians in general. And I want to get into that electronic record because that's another part of the story that seems to have really led to the demise of the relationship. And unfortunately, that represents the most digitization that's occurred so far in healthcare. You've written quite a bit about that, Danielle. Maybe you could start off on it.
Well, I think when the EMR first came, and it was a miracle, and it still is. I tend to write a lot about the faults, but I well recognize the benefits, and I don't want to go back. And I think no one's going back. I mean, the old days of trying to find the chart that was stuck in dermatology clinic or the x-ray in the surgeon's back pocket, I mean, that was terrible for patient care. And I think the EMR has really helped in that respect. However, you're right. It was really arranged for billing. And I think that's problematic in a number of realms. One is that it fragments how we think. And, we've just switched to a new medical record system. So we're kind of learning a new system from scratch. And it's incredibly complex, which to me reflects how complex medical thinking is. The paragraph you wrote in the chart by hand, that actually was the result of innumerable thought processes that it will intersect. The history, the physical, the labs, your sixth sense for the patient, the patient's nonverbal communication, all of that came together, and you have a differential in your head. In the EMR, you have to do that in a very rote way in 100 different places. So replicating the doctor's thought process is quite a complex task, and the EMR really is not up to standard for that. So I think the fragmentation, the labs are here, the consults are there, the radiology, we don't think that way. We put them all together seamlessly. So that's one problem. The second problem is that it dominates the clinician's attention. There is no way to focus on the patient and the EMR at the same time. But if you don't write in the EMR as you see the patient, you will never finish. That is not humanly possible. So most doctors are now staring at a screen. It's like the 1950s secretarial pool, the electronic indentured servitude now. And it's really impacted the ability to communicate with the patient and really hear what they're saying.
You can read the transcript from this podcast and find more Medicine and the Machine episodes at medscape.com/machine. Medscape news, features, clinical tools, and education are available for free. Stay on the pulse of medicine. Visit medscape.com.
Danielle, you've written beautifully about the challenge of taking care of people who have a language other than English. And so much of what is written in textbooks just assumes that everybody's on the same page and the history will be delivered by the patient and will record it. But at Bellevue, you have a unique opportunity to reflect on what that's like and talk a little bit about how that magnifies all the issues we're talking about. You're dealing with people who may not have the language that you have.
So this morning, I had a patient in clinic who spoke Sylheti, which up before a year or two ago, I didn't even know existed. It's a dialect of Bangladeshi. And I realized that many of my patients who I thought spoke Bengali or Bangladeshi actually spoke Sylheti. And using a Bangladeshi interpreter was actually quite limiting. And so I already, realized an error for many of my patients. But right, so we work through an interpreter, which, first of all, every layer of barrier between communication certainly changes things. And an interpreter really boils things down to the most basic, parts of the conversation, the actual facts. And you miss so much nuance. It also takes twice as long. And so I always worry that I'm missing much of what's really going on with patients. And the other aspect is education and literacy level. I had a patient with diabetes who had terrible medication, quote, non-compliance. And every time he came, I would spend an hour reorienting his medications. I'd print out this gorgeous medication list and feel so proud of myself. And it took about a year or two till he confessed to me that he could not read. Here I am giving him his list that he couldn't read at all. It could have been wallpaper on his wall, thinking I'm such a great doctor. But I could never find out because we weren't speaking English that he really couldn't read. And that was why he kept mixing up the medication. So there's so many components that go into it. So you have the patient just sign up for my chart and do all their stuff online. Well, a lot of patients either don't have access or can't, navigate that type of thing. We really, they can't make the call to arrange the radiology appointment because it's just too much.
Yeah, I think sometimes sitting in Silicon Valley and listening to the next thing in healthcare that somebody's trying to dream up, I feel they often lose sight of the reality of someone, like you on the front line in that kind of situation. But I must say, I'm sure that of all the things that you do, your humanity comes through to the patient. And I think that must mean a great deal, the relationship you build, even with a different language and an interpreter.
I mean, partly that's also the best thing about medicine. And I think the joy still comes through from both the patients and the doctors. I mean, many patients are, love coming to the doctor. And I've often thought about that. We usually think about going to the doctor as a terrible thing, but I find many patients very upbeat. They'll dress well for it. They'll bring a gift. They're prepare for this. And I think for many, they get an attention, to the issues of their life that they don't get elsewhere. And often it's just an issue of respect. Many of our patients, I sense, get disrespected in many aspects of their lives, especially many of our patients who are immigrants or in marginalized communities, transgender patients, patients who are undocumented, who really face many challenges, facing poverty, who get treated terribly in so many situations. And here's the one chance they can come to their doctor who, I think if well done, I'm here to help you. What can I do? And that's a rare thing. And it's so nice to be able to bring some joy into a patient's life. And maybe you can make them feel a little bit better. Maybe you can't cure the stuff, but you can move the needle a few degrees. And what is more amazing than that?
Well, you've outlined, more of an ideal scenario, but I think from other points that we've discussed, so many patients feel that the time they have with their doctor is so limited, and the person's not even having eye-to-eye contact because of the screen and keyboard. And there's a lot of dissatisfaction, a sense of being roughed up with a lack of attention. So, we hope that we'll be able to, in the future, restore what you just described for all patients.
Well, I'll tell you, and this is a lot of what you do, Abraham, but I've now used the physical exam in a different way. I mean, I still use it for its physical findings, but more and more I use it as a refuge from the interference of technology, because the physical exam is one of the few places where we can talk unimpeded by a screen or a recorder or a keyboard. It's just two people talking and touching with nothing else in between. And that is so rare in medicine and life in general. And so often it is during the physical exam that the patient says what's really on their mind. And so I use the physical exam as my second shot at a good history, because that's when the patient will talk about domestic violence, depression, sexual symptoms, the cough they forgot about till I auscultated their lungs. And so the physical exam, remains important for diagnosis, but also for, the second round of the history.
That is well said, Danielle, and you won't find me arguing with you. but Danielle, you probably, when you do the history, as you know, I think the average time is 18 seconds before the patient is interrupted.
At best.
No longer than 18 seconds, I'm guessing.
Yeah. Well, it's very hard. And when I talk about this a lot, when I, speak with medical students and even with the general public who are appalled when they hear that statistic and they think how rude those doctors are. But I try to explain that we're not rude, or at least most of us, but that we want to find the answer. The patient says, I have a pain over here, and we jump right in. When does it start? When does it stop? Makes it better? Makes it worse? Not because we're rude, but we want to help them feel better. But of course, if they had a second thing to say, like, I think I might have had a stroke last week, we'll miss that. And when you think about diagnostic error, which is, I think, amongst the hardest aspects of medical error, to fix, it's right there in those first 18 seconds when we jump in and divert the conversation and not get to point two, that I think we're making our biggest errors. So one of the things I try to tell my students and myself is, for the first 1 minute, don't say a thing, don't write a thing, just look at the patient, full frontal listening for 1 minute. And it's not a lot of time, but it feels like a lot. And most patients will get out what they need to say in that 1 minute. And then I'll say something like, I don't want to miss what you're saying. Would you mind if I take notes while you speak? And then I pull the computer over, and they're forgiving. They understand we have to do that. But that 1 minute is a huge investment, I think, in trust, but also in improving your diagnostic accuracy.
And that's great. Another thing about the time, the early minutes of assessing a patient, it's thought that if you think of the diagnosis in the first 5 minutes, evaluating a new patient, and as you kind of outlined, it could be quite a complex patient. If you think of that the chance of being correct is 95+%. But if you don't think of that, what turns out to be the right diagnosis, the chance of error is exceptionally large. So that, there's this very limited time, this reflexive thinking, this system one thinking, to get the answer. And otherwise, the chance of error is as high as 70%. So any thoughts about that? You're obviously, you got a book coming out next spring on error. And there's a few other things I want to ask you about that. But how can we get the error rate down in diagnosing?
So, I think when we're medical students, we write that whole exhaustive differential diagnosis, and you read those medical student write-ups, they're torturous to read because they, have a huge differential for every organ system and, and every possible etiology. And of course, we can't do that in real practice. But I think that, as Mark Graber would say, the discipline of the differential, to at least ask yourself, is there anything else it could be? Really push yourself. I know it's GERD, but is there anything else it could be? And then, is there anything I can't afford to miss? And to try and be rigorous about it, just question yourself, even for 20 seconds, I think will help with the diagnostic error. Part of it is we often never know if we're right or wrong. Patients don't come back. So we assume they got better, but maybe they died, or maybe they went to the next hospital up the block and got a different diagnosis.
Right.
So trying to get some feedback if we can. And the other thing is being comfortable with uncertainty. We are so lousy with ambiguity. We rail against it because we're programmed to be certain and confident, but to sort of make peace with uncertainty, say, I don't know what it is. It could be one of these three things, here's what we'll do, here's how we'll watch it, but to be comfortable with not having an answer and helping your patients get comfortable with uncertainty, because that's the reality in general outpatient medicine. We often don't know. We often never know. And that's just the way medicine is.
Going hand in hand with that, Danielle, you spoke very eloquently at a TED Med meeting, I think it was, on our needing to recognize that we can fail and be willing to fail and to admit our failures, that a lot of our errors come from sort of a dogged desire to not lose face, so to speak, you know?
We've been trained to be perfect, and anything less than perfect is complete failure. You know, if you're not perfect, you know, go work for a drug company or go, you know, go off to the dark side. But if you're going to be in clinical medicine, you know, be up there. That's the way we pimp on rounds. And that's really terrible because it then encourages us to lie, right? To make up what we don't know, fake it till we make it. That's terrible for a patient. We should never fake it till we make it. We should say to the patient, I don't know, or you know, what I first said, that was wrong. I was wrong. And, you know, in studies that at least have given patients hypothetical scenarios, patients are much more likely to stick with a doctor who tells them they made a mistake. They think, okay, I can trust that doctor. I know they'll be honest. And so I think patients are very willing to hear it if you tell it honestly, because they want to be able to trust you and they're worried about not knowing what's going on. So admitting an error generally instills a patient's faith in you rather than the opposite that we usually assume.
We will have to pause it there for the moment, but we'll continue our discussion with Danielle Ofri in our next episode of Medicine and the Machine. In the meantime, thank you both, Danielle and Abraham, for yet another enthralling discussion. And to our audience members, please join us for the second half of our discussion with Danielle in episode 4. We'll talk about many other topics that are integral to the patient-doctor relationship, including errors in the medical record and administrative creep.